Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast. I'm Shane Phillips. Before introducing this episode and our guest, I'd like to quickly share that the Lewis Center and Institute of Transportation Studies are holding our first in-person UCLA Arrowhead Symposium since 2019, and this year our focus will be on housing. It's happening at Lake Arrowhead from October 16th to the 18th. There are still some tickets available for purchase, and they include everything: registration, lodging, and meals for the 2.5-day event. If you live in California and work on housing in some capacity, or if you work in transportation and see housing policy as something that'll influence your work in the coming years, we invite you to attend. I'll be there along with the Housing Voice co-hosts, as well as a bunch of very smart housing scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. You can learn more about this year's program and register at www.uclaarrowheadsymposium.org. Our guest this time is Professor Tuukka Saarimaa from Aalto University and Helsinki Graduate School of Economics, both in Finland, and our topic is housing transfer taxes. We review what transfer taxes are early in this interview, so I'll keep the intro short and just say that this was a great and I think very clear discussion of the benefits and possible drawbacks of using transfer taxes to generate additional government revenue. The detailed nature of Finland's administrative data gives us insights into the impacts of policy that are often hard to duplicate in the US, since the data quality just isn't at the same level. So we're able to benefit from what they're learning 5,000 miles away. Higher, more progressive transfer taxes have been adopted by quite a few US cities in recent years, and they're on the ballot here in Los Angeles in November, so it's a subject with very immediate, concrete relevance to many of our listeners. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and we receive production support from Claudia Bustamante and Olivia Arena. You can send feedback or show ideas to shanephillips@ucla.edu, and you can give us a 5-star rating and a review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Now let's get to our conversation with Professor Saarimaa. Tuukka Saarimaa is Assistant Professor of Economics at Aalto University and Helsinki Graduate School of Economics, and he's here today to talk about a subject dear to my heart: real estate transfer taxes. Professor Saarimaa, welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And Paavo Mankinen, also of Finnish descent, is here as my co-host today. Welcome, Paavo.
Terve, Shane. Mitä kuuluu, Tuukka?
Hyvä kuuluu, kiitos.
Yes, I did it. Okay. As always, we start out with a tour from our guest. I know we are just a few months too late for the International Social Housing Conference that was held in June, so we missed the chance to check out the city then. But tell us about Helsinki a little bit. What are the go-to spots you like to take friends and colleagues who visit the city?
Yeah, so if you're visiting during the summer, which is something that I really recommend, don't come here in November, I would take you to the fortress island of Suomenlinna. So you can pick a sunny day to go there, and you can have a nice walk there, or have a picnic, go to one of the restaurants in the island, or to the local brewery. And you can also take a guided tour there if you want to. And also the boat ride to the island is quite nice, so you can see the Helsinki skyline, kind of like, which is dominated by the Helsinki Cathedral and so on. And I would also recommend other islands. You know, there are boats taking you to these other islands next to Helsinki as well, and the sea is really nice. And I guess if you're an urban planner, then there are these new residential areas that we're now building, actually right next to the city center. So there's one that used to be a harbor that we're now changing into a residential area. We're going to have roughly 30,000 new residents in the area, and a lot of offices, so mixed use, a lot of social housing, and actually some of the events of the conference that you mentioned took place in that place. So that might interest urban planners.
Yeah, Paavo, you've been?
Oh yeah, I love it. Helsinki's the best. I recommend the summer, and that boat ride is super fascinating. I mean, I think people don't realize what an archipelago style city it is. But Tuukka, I thought we were going to go to a bar. Are we going to Finland where everyone has a drinking problem? I was going to recommend, but I think I Googled it yesterday. I think it's closed. Did you ever go to this Soviet themed bar, the Karasmaki brothers? had?
Yeah. I've been there, and we used to take seminar guests there.
Okay.
So it was closed, I think, in 2019, but I think it reopened in another location. But now after the pandemic, I'm not sure whether it's open anymore. But the original location is gone anyway.
And I shouldn't spoil the idea of it, but it was fascinating. When we went, there was no one working, and there was just this old man in there drinking by himself, and then he's like, "Oh, come drink with me," and I'm like, "Okay, wait, what's going on here?" But it was all part of the deal.
Okay, so this article is in the Journal of Urban Economics, and it's titled "Revisiting the Effects of Housing Transfer Taxes," and your co-authors are. I'm going to let you say their names here.
So Essi Eerola, Oskari Harjunen, and Teemu Lyytikäinen.
Perfect. Housing transfer taxes, for those who aren't familiar with the term, are basically sales taxes on real estate. And the rates, in my experience, are usually between 1% and 5% of the sale price. Here in the US, they're often called real estate transfer taxes, and as the name suggests, they usually apply to non-residential property sales as well. So just as an example, if my city has a transfer tax rate of 2% and I sell a home for $1 million, I'll owe $20,000 in real estate transfer taxes. Unlike property taxes, which are usually collected year after year, transfer taxes are only paid when a property is sold or transferred. And since they're based on the sales price, the more you sell for, the more you pay. One upside to transfer taxes is that you are much less likely to have situations where someone can't afford to pay their tax bill. With property taxes, someone's property value might go up such that they owe more on their annual bill, but their income might not keep up with that, and they could end up with a lien on their property, and maybe even in a worst case scenario, they lose their home. Because transfer taxes are collected at sale, when sellers are usually at their most cash rich, this is less of a problem. As I said, this subject is close to my heart because I actually wrote a report advocating for higher and more progressive transfer taxes in Los Angeles, which we'll put in the show notes. And now, a few years later, we may be on the verge of passing an initiative that would do exactly that, raising about $800 million a year for affordable housing, rent assistance, right to counsel, and other important housing needs. But as I acknowledge in my report, and as the research we're going to discuss here today makes very clear, real estate transfer taxes have their trade-offs as well. I advocated for them in Los Angeles because we have very sharp constitutional restrictions on increasing property taxes or frankly making them any more equitable. And so transfer taxes were a sort of second best option, at least from my perspective. But now that we're really moving forward with them, and a few other smaller cities in our region already have adopted them, and a bunch of other places, including various Bay Area cities and Washington State, raised their transfer taxes prior to 2020. It's a good time to take stock of some of the potential downsides here as well. Ideally, this knowledge can inform future changes that will help us get the most benefits out of transfer taxes that we can, with the fewest negative consequences, and inform other cities or states considering similar policies. So, with all of that introduction out of the way, let's talk about the research. Tuukka, your primary interest here was how housing transfer taxes affect household mobility. That is, whether and to what extent transfer taxes discouraged people from moving because they discouraged people from selling their homes because they're paying more in tax. What do we know about the negative effects of reduced household mobility, and why is there a concern that transfer taxes might have that effect?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to point out here is that really the effects of transfer taxes depend on whether the housing market is dominated by owner-occupiers or renters. So if renting is the prevalent tenure mode, then I guess transfer taxes should not have, large effects on mobility. Or in other words, they shouldn't affect, which household ends up living in which housing unit. Of course, there may be some effects on which landlords happen to own which housing unit, but maybe that's not a huge problem. Mm-hmm. But in a situation when people are predominantly homeowners, like I understand is the case in the US and in Finland, then transfer taxes may affect household mobility.
Yeah, but not the case, I should say, in Los Angeles, where about 2/3 or so of our households are renters. It tends to be the case that where prices are highest, you have higher percentage of renters all over the US, and I'm sure all over the world too.
So, like in general, homeowners usually have higher or larger moving costs than renters because they have to find a buyer for their old house. They need to pay broker fees, etc. And then the transfer taxes come on top of these other costs that are already there. So why is this? So what happens here? Maybe a concrete example here would help. So let's say that there's a seller who is willing to sell her house for, say, $200,000, and there's also a buyer who is willing to pay at most $205 for that house. So here we have a situation where there are obviously potential gains for trade. So for example, the buyer could offer the seller $203,000 for the house, and the seller would happily accept that offer. However, if we were to impose a transfer tax of 4% here on the buyer, which is now the Finnish case, the buyer is paying the transfer tax, then the buyer would have to offer at least $208,000 for the house in order for the seller to get the $200,000 that she would want for the house. But the buyer is unwilling to do that in this case. So we are going to lose this potential transaction here. So why is this a problem then? Well, first of all, it may create mismatch in the housing market so that households do not live in the housing units that would be most suitable for them in their current situation. But the tax may also create mismatch in the labor market because your place of residence is tightly connected to your job location and job market opportunities. And if a better job requires a move, for example, then transfer taxes may prohibit people from changing jobs and moving to better job opportunities. But of course, this is ultimately an empirical question whether these are important effects here that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, so it seems to me that the European scholars of housing especially have been more concerned with the connection between housing markets and labor markets than those in the US. And there's this famous Oswald paper that talks about high home ownership rates leading to unemployment because people can't move to where jobs are. I wonder, does Helsinki have that kind of a problem, or why you think European scholars are kind of more concerned about household mobility, it seems like, than those in the US?
Yeah, I'm not sure why that's the case. Maybe it's because we think that the European labor market is less efficient. We have probably more unemployment than in the US traditionally. So maybe that's why we're paying more attention to any kind of additional frictions that that might affect the labor market.
Right. Interesting.
So before we discuss the Finnish case, which is the subject of your study here, and the particular advantages of the detailed data you're using and the innovation in your research design, can you talk through how scholars have typically estimated the mobility impacts of transfer taxes in previous research?
Sure. So I would say that typically we economists we try to find situations where for some reason you have a treatment group that is affected by a tax reform, and then a control group, some individuals or properties who are not affected by the tax reform. And so this is important because let's say that there's a transfer tax increase that applies to everyone, and then you want to know whether that tax increase led to lower mobility of households. But now it's really difficult to disentangle the effect of the transfer tax from all the other changes in the economy that might take place at the same time as the tax reform. And this is a very common problem in any policy evaluation work that you may be doing. So like I said, one way around this problem is to find situations where for example, a tax reform where the tax changes apply only to some individuals or properties but not to others. And if I take a good example from a recent paper using data from Toronto, so what happened there was that a transfer tax was introduced for properties within the borders of the city or the municipality of Toronto, but was not introduced in other municipalities in the greater Toronto area. Mm-hmm. So now, because of this kind of like a natural, or what we refer to as quasi-experiment, you kind of like have a treatment group and a control group. And with data before and after the tax introduction, you can kind of like tease out the causal effect of the tax increase. And the idea with this design, which is often referred to as the difference in differences design, is that the control group now here, in a sense, captures all the changes that affect both groups in the same way. And if there's any additional difference or if any additional differences arise after the tax reform, then we're kind of like quite confidently we can argue that this is because of the tax increase and not some other case, and we are able to estimate the causal effect in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, so there's like on econ Twitter, there's a lot of jokes about difference and difference. Is there anything funny or interesting for the normal person from that conversation?
Well, yeah, it seems that every week there's another paper showing, different problems with differences estimation. But I guess, I would call it progress now. Kind of like we now know much more about what we're actually estimating and what type of estimators we can use here to tease out the causal effect. So I'm kind of like happy, and I'm also really happy that these papers also come up with a solution to the problem that they're finding. So that's nice.
That's always good.
Not just pointing out flaws.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to your case study. There was a change to the housing transfer tax rate on certain kinds of housing in Finland in 2013, and you were able to use that change to test the hypothesis that higher transfer taxes lead to lower mobility rates. Before we talk about those changes, the structure of housing ownership in Finland is interesting and worth learning a little bit about. And as you said, the home ownership rate really does matter here for mobility and how transfer taxes affect them. I'd be curious to hear just what the ownership rate looks like in Finland, but also there's an interesting thing here where, unlike the US, all owner-occupied multifamily housing in Finland is cooperative ownership, not condominium. And so what is the difference there, and what does the emphasis on co-ops actually mean for Finnish households in a sort of practical day-to-day terms?
So yeah, this may be just a terminology issue, because we were kind of like unsure how to translate the system that we have into English. So why don't I explain the Finnish case, and then you can tell me whether that's actually exactly the same as you have in the US. So
I mean, we do have co-ops here too. They're just like only in New York, pretty much. They're very
and in San Francisco. There's like one in Santa Monica.
Yeah, they're pretty rare.
Yeah. So in Finland, all residential buildings with multiple housing units are kind of like legally set up as housing cooperatives or housing companies. That was the alternative translation that we thought about using. So the idea here is that the co-op, they own the building, and sometimes they have multiple buildings in the same lot, and in some cases they own the land as well. Sometimes they rent it from the city. And when you're buying a housing unit in a housing co-op, you're buying shares in the co-op that correspond to a particular housing unit. Mm-hmm. And owning these shares in practice implies that you own the unit. So you can either live there yourself, and then you're a homeowner or an owner-occupier, or you can rent it out to some other household, and then you're a landlord. So that's the way it works. And these co-ops often have, what's also relevant for the reform here is that they often have outstanding loans taken out for example, during the construction period, or because of some major renovation done later on to the building. And then these loans are allocated to the shares, and the owner of the shares is then responsible for the corresponding portion of the loan's interest payments and repayment and so on.
Pablo, that sounds to me like co-ops here, because condos, you actually own the individual unit, and co-ops, you just own sort of a share in the building that maybe sort of represents your unit and gives you the right to use your unit, but it's not the same as owning the unit itself.
Yep, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, the practical implication for the US is I think condos are easier to get a mortgage for. I think we don't have a good financing system yet set up to buy co-op shares, or is not as good as the condo, but that's more as a problem with our housing finance system. I guess maybe even the bigger difference, though, is that if I understand correctly, in Finland, most multifamily buildings are owner-occupied rather than owned by one entity and have the units rented out. Is that the case?
Yeah, and then they're also mixed, kind of like you have some owner-occupiers and some renters living in the same building.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's the home ownership rate in Finland?
The roughly 60% of households and roughly 70% of individuals are owner-occupiers, and then slightly more than half of those are in single-family houses.
It's amazing how consistent that is. The US is 66%, 65%. France is 60%. Finland 60%. Canada's probably right in that range too, despite pretty different, policies around all this stuff. So now let's actually talk about the tax reform. What was the tax reform and what was the government's rationale for making the change that they did?
So the tax reform increased the tax burden on these apartments in these co-ops, while the tax treatment of single-family houses remained unchanged. So until the end of February 2013, the transfer tax rate was 4% for houses and remained 4% for single-family houses, and it was 1.6% for the apartments in co-ops. And in both cases, the tax base then was the transaction price. Mm-hmm. Whereas after March, the 1st of March in 2013, the transfer tax for apartments, the tax rate was increased to 2%. And at the same time, the tax base was broadened so that it would include any outstanding co-op loan assigned to that apartment.
So not only did the tax rate go up by 0.4 percentage points, but also the value being taxed on a sale was often higher because it now included these the loan balances.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the rationale for the reform was mostly fiscal, so they wanted to collect more taxes, and they had an idea that people really don't care about transfer taxes when they're thinking about moving. They move anyway. This is such a small tax that it doesn't really matter. And the other rationale was to make the tax treatment of these two different homeowner types more similar. So they were increasing the tax rates would be more similar. But they were also kind of like directly worried about. So we had a phenomenon, and it's still going on, that these co-ops, especially the new buildings, they had really high co-op loans. And I guess people thought that one reason was that makes the tax base for the first buyer really low. And people were saying that that's because of the tax. So let's increase broaden the tax base. So let's get rid of that incentive. Right. But I think that hasn't changed the amount of loans that these co-ops have. So
only one way to find out if that was the reason the loan balances were so big. I guess
I'm surprised that the transfer tax isn't progressive, given that. I don't know if it's still true, but I think like even speeding tickets are tied to income levels in Finland, right? So I'm surprised that it's not a progressive rate based on the value of. Was that not part of the conversation?
Not that I remember. I don't think that we talked about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and just so folks know what that means, that just means a higher rate on higher value sales. So like if it's a $200,000 home, maybe it's 2%. If it's a $500,000 home, maybe it's 3%. That kind of thing.
You mean if it's a $5 million home, that's where the trigger starts?
We'll get there. So now that we understand this policy context a little bit better, can you tell us more about the research design that you use? Specifically, tell us about your interest in the potential for spillover effects and what that means, and how you address it in a way that other studies haven't been able to, or maybe haven't thought to. And it might make sense to mention really the quality and the breadth of the data on Finnish households here too.
Yeah. So let me start with the data. So we use population-wide individual register data from 2005 to 2016. So we have multiple years before the tax reform and multiple years after. And the data include information on individuals' incomes, education level, family structure, and so on. And we also know the housing unit for each individual at the end of each year in the data. And crucially, we know whether the household is a renter, whether they are owner-occupiers, whether they live in co-ops or in single-family houses. So we can assign all individuals into a treatment or a control group here. So ultimately what we want to know here is that, so what happened to the treatment group, which is the apartment owners here, if there was no tax increase? And then we would want to compare this to what actually happened to this same group, and then the difference would be the causal effect that we're interested in here. But obviously, here's the problem here is that we don't observe this counterfactual for the treatment group when they're not treated.
Right.
So the idea of the design here, the definitive design, is that we use the control group as the kind of like the missing counterfactual. So in the absence of the tax increase, mobility in the treatment group would have developed in the same way as it did in the control group. That's kind of like the assumption that we're relying on here. And we can test this assumption indirectly by looking at what happened, before the treatment. So by showing what happened in treatment and control groups before the reform, whether they developed similarly or whether they had common trends before the treatment, kind of like allows us to indirectly test whether that assumption is true or not. But at the same time, I'm coming to the spillovers here. This design works only if the control group is not indirectly affected by the tax reform. So if homeowners in the treatment group living in the apartments in the co-ops move less often because of the tax increase, then maybe the homeowners also in the control group are indirectly affected because they have less trading partners to interact with.
Mm-hmm.
So households in the treatment group are less willing to move now. So maybe that affects, whether the control group households can find.
There might just be fewer homes on the market.
Yeah,
apartments specifically for them to move into.
Because people move between groups.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have house people and apartment people,
No.
and they never mix. Yeah.
And of course, this might be a problem, So the definitive estimate in this case would be biased towards zero because it would be a combination of the true effect and the spillover effect. And the spillover effect is now the indirect effect of the reform on homeowners in the control group. And I guess the key contribution of our paper, because there have been other papers on transfer taxes before us, the key contribution is kind of like take this spillover problem seriously and try to quantify the bias caused by this spillover effect. And we can do this basically because our data is so good that we can actually see, moves between the treatment and control groups before and after the reform, so that we can first of all show that it's true that people move from single-family houses to apartments and vice versa. So there's a potential for this problem here. So that's one thing. So a lot of the other papers have used transaction data. So not data on household mobility, but rather how many transactions take place. And in those cases, you usually don't have any information on these potential spillovers. It's impossible to observe, whether there's even potentially a problem there. So with this kind of like, I'm not going to go into the details here. It's a modeling exercise that we do here. So we use the information that we have in the data on these mobility rates across the different housing market segments, and also our definitive estimate that we get by running the usual definitive estimation there. So we kind of like put in these pre-reform mobility rates across different groups into the model and our definitive estimate, and in a sense we ask the model to tell us, what happens to the mobility rate in the control group given these numbers that we kind of like put into the model. And then we can, in a sense, back out the spillover effect using this approach. This is of course not a perfect approach, but
they never are.
Yeah.
So what did you find? What was the impact on mobility of the tax increase for the treatment group, for the apartment owners and sellers and buyers? And then what did it look like when you included these spillover effects into the house market, not just the apartment market?
Yeah. So first some basic numbers here. So before the reform, the annual mobility rate in the treatment group was roughly 7.5%. So in other words, 7.5% of the homeowners living in these apartments moved during a given year. Mm-hmm. And so what we found was that the mobility rate decreased in this treatment group because of the tax increase by roughly 7.2%. And this estimate takes into account the spillover problem here. And then what happened to the control group, what we find is that these spillover effects are important. It's important to take them into account. So we found that due to the tax reform, the mobility rate decreased in the control group by some 1.6%.
So it's higher for the treatment group, the apartment owners, and there is also an impact on the house owners. Got it.
Right.
Hey, this is Shane coming in after the recording. I wanted to insert a little more explanation here because I realized that even as I was re-listening to this, I was having some trouble understanding exactly how this was done and why this was different from the traditional approach. The difference in difference calculation Tuukka is referring to here, the diff in diff, is the difference between the change in mobility rates for apartment owners and the change in mobility rates for house owners following the tax increase on apartment sales. So it's the difference between those two differences in mobility rates. If a reduction in mobility for apartment owners also reduces the number of trading partners for house owners, such that house owners move less often, then the difference between the two will actually be smaller, and it'll make the impact of the tax seem smaller as well. In Tuukka's and his colleagues' research, they found that mobility for apartment owners fell by 7.2%, but mobility for house owners also fell by 1.6%. The difference between those two changes in mobility rates, the diff in diff, is 5.6%. He's making the point that the gap between the changing apartment owner and house owner mobility rates doesn't tell the whole story because they both fell, and there's good reason to believe that they both fell because of the tax increase. Usually in this kind of diff-in-diff analysis, you would say that the impact was just however much more or less the treatment group, which is the apartment owners whose taxes went up, changed relative to the control group, which is the house owners whose taxes didn't change. But that doesn't make sense here because the impact is spilling over into the control group. The spillover is the 1.6% reduction that's affecting both the apartment owners and the house owners, in addition to the 5.6% reduction that's affecting only the apartment owners. Okay, back to the interview.
Tuukka, that all sounds pretty convincing, but I'm worried about potential threats to validity of this kind of research. Were there concerns you had in your study? I mean, or anything interesting you'd like to point out in terms of issues that in addition to this spillover consideration, what else might have made these estimates a little bit off?
Yeah, so the problem here would be that, if something happened exactly at the same time as the tax reform that affected the groups differently, then we would have a problem. And, and it's hard to tell whether any diff analysis has this problem, but at least we can say that we are not aware of any other major policy changes coinciding with the tax reform that would affect housing markets, and especially ones that would affect the treatment and control groups differently.
Right.
And also, I think that since we have so much data before the reform, although going back all the way to 2005, and we can show that the mobility rates in treatment and control groups, they follow each other quite nicely, even during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So we're kind of like, that's pretty convincing evidence that of this assumption that of common sense, although this is not direct evidence of saying that nothing else could have happened at exactly the same time as the tax reform.
And the fact that you don't use transactions, I mean, did you consider how, are people suddenly moving without selling much more than they had before?
Yeah, this would be an interesting thing to look at, but unfortunately we don't have.
I wouldn't imagine it's a huge problem.
Yeah,
but it
probably
could
not.
Be happening.
So currently we don't have this type of data, so we don't have asset ownerships for these people in the data. So we don't know whether they end up kind of like owning their old apartment once they move.
Right. And how about timing? I know you looked at this as well, that maybe they knew that the tax increase was coming and it was actually even delayed by a few months. And so maybe they tried to sell their home before to kind of evade that tax or get out ahead of it. What did you find there? Because I know, as I said, you did look into that.
Yeah, so we cannot look at that using our household data because we only observe people at the end of the year. But we have monthly level data on overall transactions in these different groups. And what we find is that there's a really clear kind of like people anticipate the reform. They really sell, just a couple of months before the tax increase, and there's a huge increase in transactions. And then after the reform, there's a clear reduction, but then it comes back to kind of like...
Which I got to say, seems like for a 0.4% percentage point tax increase, it's kind of surprising that people are making this huge decision. I mean, I'm sure many of them had already been thinking like, I think I'm going to sell at some point. I might as well push it up. But it's... I don't know. I guess 0.4% still adds up to hundreds or thousands of dollars in many cases. So it's not nothing.
Yeah, but it's pretty easy to kind of like just bring the sale forward for a few months.
Yeah,
that's easy. I mean, but what's more surprising is that the actual mobility results that we find.
Yeah, they're pretty large. What about, so in addition to the kind of this overall effect of the tax, you know, you are able to look into several more specific impacts, including welfare and labor market outcomes, as well as how big of a house the move people were thinking to make was affected by the tax, differences between households that were upsizing, downsizing. I don't know, Shane, I thought the most interesting outcomes were on this kind of how far people are moving and whether this tax had a differential impact on short moves versus long moves. As well as kind of moves to much bigger houses or moves to much smaller houses. Maybe, Tuukka, if you want to tell us about the findings on those two first and others that you found interesting.
Yeah, so the labor market question was, like you said, there's a lot of talk about labor market effects of these transfer taxes in a lot of countries. So it was interesting, but we also, our initial idea was that we were expecting to see, you know, close to zero effects for these moves that are related to labor markets, because it seemed to us that labor market related moves are kind of like more valuable to households compared to moves that happen because of relocating within a city or kind of like doing a size adjustment to the unit. So we were thinking that people would not turn down kind of like job offers or something like that.
Yeah, because the idea is that I'm not going to move to that new job in a new city because of this additional $5,000 tax on my house sale.
Exactly.
And it's not $5,000 when we're talking about an additional 0.4 percentage points.
But you know, it would have to be a lot of money to change.
Or a very minor job upgrade,
and we do find that, you know, so we're looking at moves that are more than 50 kilometers or less than 50 kilometers. That's an ad hoc, kind of like I don't know where that threshold came from, but, you know.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So what we actually found was that, the effect is smaller for these longer moves, but there's still an effect. So we cannot rule out that the transfer tax actually has labor market effects as well. But they are small, kind of like the effects on moving is much smaller than on moves that happen kind of like within a labor market or within a city.
Interesting.
And then you have a finding about how transfer taxes seem to affect upward moves, meaning moves when people buy larger or more expensive homes, but not downward moves to less expensive or smaller homes. In the model researchers have of how people move, and this was kind of news to me, but it makes sense, there's this asymmetry between upward and downward moves. Basically, people move multiple times throughout their lives, but they tend to make smaller, more incremental upgrades to their housing or to their neighborhood quality each time they move up, but they might only downsize once or twice in their lives, you know, closer to the end of their lives, presumably, all at once. Could you talk about that and why an increased transfer tax might affect upsizing but not downsizing?
Sure. So I guess this is related to the concept of a housing career. So I guess a typical housing career might be that first you get married, then you have a child, then maybe a few years later you'll have another child and so on. And while your family is growing, the need for housing space increases as well. And people usually upsize as their family size increases. But things may change when you introduce a transfer tax to the picture here. So instead of upsizing kind of like one bedroom at a time, it could be that you upsize 2 bedrooms at a time, so that you don't have to move as often. You get to avoid one transfer tax payment by doing that. So maybe you live longer in a small apartment with one child, and then buy a much larger house where you can fit your whole kind of like family, or you upsize when the second child is born, and not when the first child is born.
Or maybe like upsize a little early before you really need the extra space.
Exactly. Whereas when you're downsizing, then these moves they may be more often related to different types of unplanned events, like a divorce or unemployment or death of a spouse, where you might think that these tax incentives don't play as big of a role as in these when you're moving up the housing ladder.
It's not exactly voluntary either way, so you just gotta do it.
Yeah. I'm not saying that this is the correct story, but this is at least consistent with the findings that we have in the paper.
And I think, in cases where it's not involuntary, it's not a divorce, it's not the death of a spouse, maybe it's just like you're an empty nester couple and you just want to downsize. And I think in that case, you've owned your home probably for a long time. You probably have quite a few resources compared to the average person. And your new home is going to be less expensive than your old one probably. So the idea that like this tax is going to deter you from that just doesn't make as much sense. So you also estimate how the transfer tax increase impacted welfare, which economists use to refer to the general welfare of society rather than the way the word is often used in the US to mean basically government support. And you find that the overall impact is negative, basically that the reduction to welfare is greater than the increase in revenues euro for euro. But what I wasn't really clear on is how you arrived at the change in welfare itself, what that calculation looked like. So I'd like to hear you talk about that. But just to kind of expand on this first, welfare to me seems to be a very encompassing concept. And so it should take into account the negative impacts to mobility and housing consumption, but also the positive impacts of the revenues raised by the increased taxes, the things that revenue will be spent on. And I think where I'm struggling with this is that a higher tax might lead to fewer moves, but the quality of life benefits of that move might be pretty marginal. I think, in fact, they would almost have to be if such a small tax increase were to discourage someone or stop someone from moving. But on the revenue side, those euros might help someone who's homeless get back into housing, or help a very poor person pay for rent or food. And those seem to me to have much greater value, even if the dollar or euro value is the same. And I guess I'm getting into kind of philosophical territory.
It sounds like utilitarianism.
Yes, we're talking about the marginal utility of money and how $1 means a lot more to a poor person than a rich person, which we don't need to go down that road. But I'd just be curious to hear a bit more about the limitations of this metric, and maybe that can lead us to some other discussion of the benefits and costs and trade-offs of transfer taxes.
Yeah, sure. So this might be a little bit difficult to unpack, but so first of all, the welfare loss here is simply the fact that, the example that I gave earlier of the buyer and the seller, we're now foregoing kind of like these mutually beneficial trades because of the transfer tax. So that's kind of like basically the welfare effect here. And I guess the number here that you're talking about, it's or the metric, it's most useful when we're actually comparing different ways of collecting the same amount of tax revenue.
Okay.
So let's take the amount of tax revenue as given, and let's think about what are the different types of tax instruments that we can use, and then compare the welfare, kind of like these welfare losses from these different types of taxes.
Yeah.
So I think that it's kind of like useful in this kind of like a limited, more limited sense.
Yeah. Well, I can also understand that, I can say, well, if you spent those revenues helping a homeless person, that's going to have more value. But like, for one, I don't know that that's how that money is going to be spent. It's all kind of just part of the government budget. And so it's sort of cherry picking a little bit to say it that way. I think thinking about it in terms of how does this way of raising that amount of revenue versus that way is a really helpful way of thinking about it. Pablo, you had something?
No, I was just going to say, it's not a total cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
It's just comparing different kinds of costs.
Okay.
And usually if we think about, what are good taxes, so in economics, we usually think that a good tax is such that it doesn't affect the behavior of the taxpayers, or that it should affect the behavior as little as possible. Of course, we have corrective taxes, like, taxes on negative externalities that the whole idea is to affect.
Behavior.
So we want to affect behavior, but when we have kind of like taxes where we just want to have, tax revenue, then we kind of like think that a good tax is such that it doesn't really affect the behavior of the taxpayers. And I guess the underlying assumption there is that people are kind of like the best judges of what they want to do. So if some people wants to move, and then we put a tax in place which prohibits that move, then we argue that family would have been in a better situation if they actually had made the move.
So we are going to talk about land value tax.
Yeah. So if I bring the point home here by comparing the transfer tax to a property tax or a land value tax. So a well-designed property tax, like a land value tax, is like a lump sum tax, meaning that this is again a bit of economic jargon here, but it means that the property tax on land does not affect the behavior of the landowner. And this is because, whatever the best use of the land was before the property tax, it still is the same after the tax is introduced. Like, let's say that you have a landowner who thinks that, okay, the best use for my land here is to build a multi-story building here of a particular size. Then the government just says that, oh, you have to pay, 10,000 in property taxes based on land value. There's nothing you can do about it, because if land value is not decided by the landowner, if it's decided by markets, then there's nothing that the landowner can do here to avoid the tax. So it's still the best option for him to build that same sized building.
Right. Because the tax is on the land and not the improvements, not on the building.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
no downside to them to building that structure. Yeah. You talked about distortion earlier, and I did want to ask this question about, in a way, the transfer tax, as it was prior to the 2013 reform, was already distorting because it was a higher tax on houses, detached homes, as opposed to apartments, multifamily units. I mean, could this be seen as a way of just, rather than reducing welfare, but actually reducing the distortion that was there? And I say this as someone who generally thinks we should actually tax detached homes at a higher rate because they do have some negative externalities relative to multifamily. But is that a reasonable way of thinking about this, or am I missing something there?
No, I think that's completely right. So you can think about the reform as kind of like bringing the tax treatment of these two building types closer together. So there's probably no good reason to have separate tax rates for apartments and single family houses. At the same time, I would say that I would favor a revenue neutral tax reform where we would have the same tax rate on apartments and single family houses, but you wouldn't increase the overall tax burden or the tax revenue that you raise through transfer taxes.
So you might actually lower the tax rate on houses.
Yeah.
I have a side eye at that. I'm not sure I'm on board with that one.
What, Tuukka? I'm so curious. We were going to ask it earlier, but I think now is a good time, about kind of the general package of property related taxes in a city like Helsinki. So how high are property taxes, and are they calculated based on land and improvements? And are development taxes widely used as well? So kind of requiring developers to pay to fund public services when they apply for a permit.
So in general, property taxes are collected by the municipalities, which is the local level, but the transfer tax is collected by the central government. So that's one important thing here.
Like the reverse of the U.S. in some respects.
Yeah. So property taxes are pretty low in Finland. They have been increasing over the years here. We have a separate tax rate that applies to land, residential lots, and a separate tax on buildings. Mm-hmm. And we are actually now introducing a pure land value tax in the coming years, because the current land value tax, that tax rate also applies to business properties, to business buildings. So you're not able to increase the property tax on land without increasing the property tax on business buildings as well. But that's going to change shortly. So what was the rest of the question?
What was is there a tax, a widely used tax on development? Meaning, if a developer wants to build a building, do they have to pay?
Not a tax per
fund
se.
Public services.
Yeah, not a tax that you always would have to pay, but municipalities kind of like they are allowed to make these deals that there's a fee involved if you want to kind of like develop a land, and that is municipality specific. So there's no general.
Sounds like impact fees, like we have here, basically.
So I guess the important thing here about transfer taxes and property taxes is that, so it might be difficult to kind of like, you want to lower the transfer tax and increase property taxes, but it's difficult to do because the coordination might be difficult.
Yeah. Well, and I think just people, in my experience, have more negative feelings toward property taxes, just as a general rule, than they do toward transfer taxes. Maybe because they're just not super familiar with transfer taxes, but I think the fact that transfer taxes only hit once, at the time of sale, you might sell multiple times in your life, but it's not this year after year thing. I've come to appreciate that it's like property taxes and gas taxes are the two that people are the most irrational about. And they're just, they hate them no matter what. They never support them going up. But
yeah, I've noticed that too.
So we started to talk about, alternatives and welfare and all of this. And you find that transfer taxes have this negative impact on mobility. And because of that, they also negatively impact welfare in some important ways. But there are better and worse kinds of taxes, as that cost of public funds ratio that you alluded to measures. And all of these different kinds of taxes have costs. So do you think they still make sense, transfer taxes make sense, if alternatives like land value taxes, like property taxes more generally, are maybe non-starters politically, or in the case of California here, unconstitutional without, a statewide ballot initiative? And in addition to that question of, do they make sense as alternatives, are there ways to limit some of these unintended consequences, whether reduced mobility or otherwise?
So I guess if your hands are really tied in terms of what tax instruments you have at your disposal, then and you have to collect some taxes, then obviously you need to tax what you can. And I guess the
have to is always questionable, but like often would like to, yes.
Yeah. And this is, by the way, probably one of the reasons that we actually have a transfer tax in the first place, because it used to be the most easy way to tax people. Compared to wealth, for example, you can it's easy to measure. You can see the transaction taking place, you can see the price, and you can tax it. But for example, it's much more difficult to estimate the value of wealth or even measure income correctly and something like that.
And to collect it, because if someone has all their wealth in stock, then you can't really force them to sell it, or people don't really like to do that. Or if it's all in fancy paintings, it's just hard to actually assess and collect the taxes compared to transfer taxes, because there's a bunch of money trading hands right at that moment.
Yeah, but I guess that's kind of like, that used to be the case. I think that with current technology, with income taxes and consumption taxes, like the value added tax that we have in Europe, you can kind of have more efficient taxes that you can actually collect pretty easily. So,
right. I wonder, do you think people think about this as a wealth tax, or kind of part of a redistribution model of approach to taxation, or is it just a pragmatic way for the government to get more money?
To me, it seems like it's a pragmatic way to get more money. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, and that's why, because if it were thought of in a kind of wealth tax sense, then you would want to have a progressive rate to tax wealthier individuals higher.
Yeah. And how about the different ways of structuring this? I guess I'll mention here in LA, I said at the beginning that we have this ballot initiative that we're going to be voting on in November. And that would increase transfer taxes only on properties valued over $5 million or $5 million and up. And I will say, although I support that initiative, I do think that threshold is way too high. But one feature of that approach is that it won't affect the vast majority of home buyers and home sellers. Even in a place as expensive as LA, it's really going to be limited to, the ultra luxury single family homes and then apartments, basically, and commercial properties and so forth. So do you think that approach is superior, overall, or is it maybe just ultimately trading one set of costs and benefits for a different set of costs and benefits?
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with the LA case here, but I guess in general terms, we economists tend to think that we should have, broad tax bases with very little kind of like exemptions and low rates. So that would be the way to go here, instead of having, a lot of exemptions, and
right. And that's what, when Professor Manville and I get together and talk about the costs and benefits of different tax structures.
As you do.
The way I frame it is, if you think about taxes on development, you're going to raise much less money because the base is so narrow. Well, then you talk about taxes on transfers, you're expanding the base considerably because there's many more sales than new buildings being built. But then a property tax, right? That's the ideal because, or land value tax, because the base is every property, right?
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. And I will say, our buddy, council member Alex Fish, helped author a ballot initiative for Culver City for 2020 that they that did pass that increased transfer taxes in a progressive way on properties worth $1.5 million or more. And I think the initial estimate at the time it was drafted was this would raise about $8 million a year. But in fact, there have been a few very large sales of, $500 million properties or something just in the past several months. And so this tax that was supposed to raise $8 million a year, and maybe it will consistently do that by, with the sale of these $1.5 million, $2 million detached homes. But because of those giant sales, it's raising like 20 something, $30 million in this year alone. It's sort of you've got the broad base to rely on, but then you get these giant spikes at times, which is, extra money. And for a city of 30,000 people, an extra $30 million can go a long way. Well, I want to give you, as we close out here, Tuukka, I want to give you the opportunity to let our listeners know if there's anywhere they can find you or, what you're working on. But I did want to
mention your other cool paper.
This is what I just wanted to make sure. I haven't even read it in detail. I've only skimmed through it, but it's maybe the best title of a paper I've read in a long time. It's called "I Don't Care to Belong to Any Club That Will Have Me as a Member: Empirical Analysis of Municipal Mergers." I am looking forward to reading it. It's almost a decade old at this point, but I just want to congratulate you on a really excellent title for that article.
Thank you. That's my only Marxian work that I've done. That's a Groucho Marx quote.
Nice.
But I was going to mention you also did a residential moves estimate of impact of new housing construction on the city and the spirit of Asquith and Mast. So I would point people to that paper as well, using the same data, right?
Yeah, or even actually better. Now we have better location data that we were able to use in that paper. So,
all right. Well, Tuukka Saarimaa, thank you for coming on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You can read more about Tuukka's research on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is at L Pavo. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.